your room again. Thanks. Yeah, okay, thanks a lot for this introduction. So indeed, I will today mainly focus on my research on national nostalgia as a specific form of collective nostalgia. And actually, this also relates to the issue of identity continuity that Laurent just introduced, but I'll explain you everything about it. So I just want to explain you the research line that I've been working on over the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years.
We don't hear you anymore. You cut your microphone.
For some reason.
Yeah, so... you hear me again, right? Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's 40 minutes, I think, this talk, and it might be nice to take a short break in between because I always think 40 minutes is really long for an online thing. So maybe in the middle I'll take a break. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about the relevance and the theoretical background of this topic of national nostalgia. And then I have 3 different empirical parts that I would like to discuss. The first one really focuses on what the consequences are of national nostalgia for group processes and intergroup relations. The second part focuses more on the generalizability of such group processes in relation to national nostalgia across countries. So I will present a cross-cultural study and also talk a little bit more about the triggers of national nostalgia. And the last empirical part is my most recent work, which focuses on the relationship between national nostalgia and support for populist radical right-wing parties. So let's first talk a little bit about the broader picture here. So you could say that nostalgia for the country, so national nostalgia, is really related to the bigger debates that we see in the world and also in academia on the so-called crisis of national identity. And I think some of you might be familiar with it. But the idea is, and this is put forward by both academics, but also politicians, that as a consequence of all kinds of rapid social cultural changes related to globalization, modernization, increasing immigration and cultural diversity, that people no longer have a clear idea of who we are as a national community and what binds us together. So this is the so-called crisis of national identity, that nations or nation states would have a sort of a difficulty defining of what their common national identity is. And what you see in these debates is that there is a tendency to look back to the past as a means to find an answer to this question, right? Who are we as a national community? And you can see national nostalgia as a manifestation of this. So this tendency to look back to the past as a means to define the national community. Well, you also see that national nostalgia is widespread across the world. So you might know this Ipsos global trend surveys. They carry out all these surveys on a yearly basis, asking people all kinds of questions about societal issues. And one of the statements that they also address is, I would like my country to be the way it used to be. And what you see here in the graph is the percentage of people that either agrees or disagrees with this statement across a wide range of countries. And if you just look at this picture quickly, you already see that in most countries, more than 50% of the population actually agrees with this, right? And in the other countries, it's also very high. So there seems to be a widespread sentiment of national nostalgia across the world. So it's a relevant phenomenon, and it's also timely because, of course, we have seen that nostalgia for the country is increasingly used by populist radical right parties to mobilize their voters. So it's an increasingly important part of their so-called rhetoric. So we have, of course, seen election of Donald Trump with his slogan, Make America Great Again. In the Netherlands, we have, for instance, Geert Wilders from the Party for Freedom, who talks about the Netherlands ours again. And you probably have similar examples in your countries. So what you see is that these politicians typically talk about the glorious days of our national past, when we were still ethnically and culturally more homogeneous. and that this was the reason why it was also more glorious. And they used this national nostalgic portrayal to mobilize their voters for their exclusionary standpoints and their anti-immigration standpoints. I'll talk more about that later. Often these voters are also labeled as nostalgia voters. So it's a relevant topic. So I decided to study this and focus on the following research questions. So what are the triggers and functions of national nostalgia? What are the consequences for both intra-group and intergroup relations? Can we generalize such findings across countries? And also, what is the relationship with populist radical right party ideology and voting? So I focus on the nostalgia that people can experience in relation to their national identity. I take the perspective of mainly native majority members in the Western context. A lot of my research is also related to the Dutch, the Netherlands, the Dutch context. And I take a multidisciplinary perspective, which means that I depart from social psychology, but I really use a lot of insights from mainly sociology and political science, and to some extent also anthropology, because there's also quite some writings on national and collective forms of nostalgia in these disciplines. So let me talk a little bit more about research in social psychology on nostalgia. So psychologists agree that nostalgia is an emotion, and it's mainly defined as a sentimental longing for a positively remembered past. But the most sort of traditional line of research on nostalgia, which is quite big, I have to say, in psychology, is research that focuses on personal nostalgia. So that means the nostalgia that you can experience in relation to your personal identity. So things that are unique to you as an individual. Think of your unique childhood experiences, for instance. And this body of research really looks at how this personal nostalgia affects all kinds of individual processes related to mental health and well-being, often showing that it's actually quite a positive emotion in that sense. Well, so a couple of years ago, together with colleagues from Utrecht University, we introduced the concept of collective nostalgia on the basis of intergroup emotions theory. Some of you might be familiar with this theory, but it's really the idea that people can also experience emotions on the basis of their social identity, right? So that part of your identity that you derive from your memberships in social groups. And even though the emotional experience may be the same, right? So it both concerns a longing for a positively remembered past. The referent of nostalgia, or the object of nostalgia, is the group rather than the individual for collective forms of nostalgia. So you can define it as a longing for objects, periods, or events from your group past rather than your individual past. So national nostalgia can then be seen as a specific form of collective nostalgia that is based on national identity, right? So in this line of research, we really wanted to see is collective nostalgia, and in my case particularly national nostalgia, relevant for understanding group processes and intergroup relations. So this is kind of how it started. I often get the question, why would you want to study nostalgia? Because this is really something for the elderly, right? Only old people are nostalgic. Well, I can tell you this is not true. And this is especially not true when you talk about national nostalgia. So empirically speaking, we have a lot of data. And again and again, we see that younger people can be just as nostalgic as older people, even though for personal nostalgia, older people tend to be a little bit more nostalgic. But for national nostalgia, interestingly, it's often almost equal. And sometimes even younger people are more nostalgic for the national past. So how can this be? Well, the reason is, of course, that national nostalgia is based on collective memories, right? So it's memories from a group that are passed on from generation to generation. This can be through family members, but of course the media also plays a large role. So of course also younger generations get a nostalgic portrayal of their group. And even though they may have not been alive at the time, this second-hand nostalgia, as they call it, right? So it's second-hand, not first-hand, can be just as strong as first-hand nostalgia. So that's important to keep in mind. It's something that can sort of occur for all kinds of generations. So let's talk a little bit about what we know already about the triggers and functions of nostalgia. So scholars across social scientific disciplines agree that the most important trigger of the emotion of nostalgia is a feeling of identity discontinuity. And this means basically the feeling that your identity is changing in a way that you do not like. So the idea that who you are in the past is not connected to who you are in the present, right? So your continuity is disrupted in a way. And the idea is that this triggers nostalgia because nostalgia is an emotion, and emotions are often seen as functional, right? They serve important functions for people. And in this case, the function of nostalgia is proposed to be restoring a sense of identity continuity. So restoring a sense of identity over time for people in times of change. And we also know from research that identity continuity, both for personal identity, but also for social identities, is an important psychological need for people, right? People need a sense of continuity in order to have a sense of identity. The reason that nostalgia is seen to restore identity continuity is because in longing for these good old days of your personal or collective past, it also becomes clear which aspects of your identity are important for you and which aspects you want to reaffirm and maintain in the present and in the future. So in my research, I started wondering, well, we know more or less that theoretically speaking, this is the case. There was also some evidence that this would work for personal nostalgia, but would a similar mechanism occur for national nostalgia? Is it triggered by a feeling that the continuity of national identity is at stake? And does it subsequently help national group members to protect this continuity of the national in-group? Okay, another part focuses on the consequences for intra and intergroup relations. And here I mainly focus on intergroup emotions theory and self-categorization theory. So intergroup emotions theory, so that's IET, proposes that the function of collective emotions or group-based emotions is to regulate intergroup attitudes and behaviors. So if we assume that the function of nostalgia or national nostalgia is to restore the identity continuity of the in-group, it is likely that the behaviors and the attitudes that follow from national nostalgia have the goal of protecting this identity continuity. Well, we propose that ways in which group members can try to protect the continuity of their national identity is by engaging in group protectionism, right? Wanting to protect national identity, culture, traditions, but also by, for instance, rejecting groups that are seen as undermining or threatening the continuity of this identity. And often in the case of national identity, this is related to anti-immigrant attitudes and behaviors. Well, then self-categorization theory comes in that you are most likely also familiar with. So it's about us versus them distinctions, right? And how people categorize themselves and others. And we propose that one important explanatory mechanism why national nostalgia results in these in-group protectionist and anti-immigrant attitudes and behaviors is because it results in exclusionary understandings of nationhood that are based on the distinction between old-timers versus newcomers. And I'll explain that a bit more. So the idea is that in longing for these good old days of your group's past, it also, of course, becomes clear who is part of this positively remembered past and who is not. So it marks group boundaries between those who are part of the past, the old-timers, and those who are not, the newcomers. And there was already some evidence for this in, for instance, the organizational context when I started out my research, that nostalgia for the collective past tends to result in processes of social categorization in relation to old-timers versus newcomers. Well, in the context of national identity, this of course often relates to the original inhabitants of the country, so often the native majority members, versus groups that came later, immigrants or refugees. Well, you already kind of see in this picture that all these things together also make it likely that national nostalgia is related to more support for populist radical right parties. These parties, of course, often rely on exclusionary understandings of nationhood in their ideology, but also they often claim to wanting to protect, right, the continuity of the national in-group. So, well, that's sort of a short summary of the theoretical assumptions, theoretical perspectives here. Let's now move to the data. I just wanted to share this quote with you. It's from SVETLANA BOYM, which is one of the most famous writers, I would say, on nostalgia. She published a book on the future of nostalgia, in which she says, the moment we try to repair longing with a particular belonging, so the apprehension of loss with a rediscovery of identity, and especially of a national community and a unique and pure homeland, we often part ways and put an end to mutual understanding. So this kind of illustrates what I've tried to explain you here, that's trying to repair longing with belonging, so trying to repair continuity by longing for a particular homeland of the past can have destructive consequences for intergroup dynamics. And I'll show you my findings here. So most of my work has been done in the Dutch context for this part. And as a first step, before I started out looking at the relationships with group dynamics, I wanted to show that national and personal nostalgia are not only theoretically, but also empirically distinct. So I did surveys and also replicated this finding again and again using different samples, where we would basically try to assess personal and national nostalgia and put them into a factor analysis and seeing whether they load on separate factors. I just wanted to give you an example of how we measure these things. So we would ask people on a scale from 1 to 5, ranging from never to very often, how often do you long for the following things from the past? The first 3 items here focus then on personal nostalgia, so my family house, my childhood toys, my school. And the 4th to 6th focus on national nostalgia, so the way Dutch people were, the way Dutch society used to be, the way the Dutch landscape looked like. And we also had 2 more general items. So how often do you bring to mind nostalgic experience, either related to your childhood for personal nostalgia or related to the way the Netherlands was in the past? And when you throw these things in a factor analysis, it's very clear that it's empirically distinct. People see these as different things. So I just wanted to present you 2 multiple study papers in this empirical part, which really focus on the idea that I presented to you. So national nostalgia relates to in-group belonging and protectionism and anti-immigrant attitudes, and this can be explained by exclusionary understandings of nationhood based on the past, based on historical roots, marking this distinction between old-timers versus newcomers. And here I focus on the notion of autochthony and ethnic belonging. I will explain to you what I mean with these concepts now. So we can say that autochthony and ethnic national belonging are both exclusionary understandings of nationhood that involve the past somehow, but they're also a little bit different. So autochthony basically refers to the idea that primal occupants of a territory, so the first comers, are more entitled and also own a territory more than newcomers. And this is a concept that is originally from anthropology, but it was introduced in psychology by colleagues of mine that some of you also know, such as Borja Martinovic and Michael Verkuijten. So you clearly see this distinction between old-timers and newcomers here, right? But it's really based on territory, on place. And then we have the notion of ethnic national belonging, which really is the idea, it's related also to ethnic nationalism, right? So the idea that you can only be a true national when you are of native descent, right? So it's based on ancestry and also common blood ties. So it also marks the distinction between old-timers and newcomers, but more based on ancestry and descent, and not so much on place. Well, these things are also empirically distinct from one another. So in one paper I examined, so this shows Dutch national nostalgia, the mills and the milkmaid, whether this strengthens autochthony beliefs and hereby results in more opposition to Muslim expressive rights. So the right to wear a headscarf or the right to build mosques. We often know that Muslim immigrants are at the center of the debates about national identity and cultural diversity, and especially these expressive rights. So we basically assess this model in different studies, where we, for instance, in one study also showed that it's really national and not so much personal nostalgia that relates to autochthony beliefs, which subsequently then translate into more opposition to Muslim expressive rights. I also gave some examples of items that we would use. So for autochthony, the Netherlands belongs more to native Dutch than to immigrant minorities because native Dutch were here first. And for Muslim expressive rights, we basically ask people, to what extent do you believe that Muslims in the Netherlands should be allowed to, well, and then we gave them different elements, so build mosques or found Islamic schools, for instance. Well, we did this in a multiple study fashion where we also tried to replicate a certain model among a broader sample, also using different kinds of measurements for the proposed constructs. I won't go into detail that much now, but we basically also replicated this model in a broad and representative sample, also controlling for all kinds of relevant potential confounders, such as age, national identification, political orientation, and education. And interestingly, we also did an experiment in this study in which we randomly assigned about 60 native Dutch students in a lab setting to either a national nostalgia or control condition. And I just wanted to also show you how we manipulated this. So in this national nostalgia condition, we asked people, please bring to mind the good and the nice things from the Netherlands of the past. They had to think about the things that evoked nostalgia in them, so in relation to the Dutch past. And then they had a writing task. So they had to write down what they missed from the Netherlands of the past and how that made them feel nostalgic. In the control condition, we also asked people to write about something that concerned the Netherlands, so an event that made the news last year and also concerned the Netherlands. To also write about national identity in a way, and also to write about the past, but not nostalgia. And we did this as a control condition in order to differentiate the salience of national identity and the past from the nostalgia, right? So because you could also say, okay, if you would just have this national nostalgia condition and a baseline, aren't you simply making national identity salient, right? So this is, yeah, you can also read that later when you're interested in how we manipulated this. But we indeed also found that people in a national nostalgia condition were more likely to endorse these autochthony beliefs, which then translated into more opposition to Muslim expressive rights. And I recently also replicated, more or less replicated this experiment among a representative sample. So I did the same manipulation basically, and I found that it also results in more prejudice towards Muslims if you assess this with a feeling thermometer, and also more prejudice towards immigrants in general in the Dutch context. So there seems to also be some evidence for the causality proposed here. In the second paper, I really delved into this notion of ethnic belonging as an explanatory mechanism, and I not only focused on prejudice, but also the idea of in-group protectionism and in-group belonging as a consequence of national nostalgia and ethnic nationhood. Here I only had cross-sectional data, so I had 3 survey studies online through survey companies. 2 of them were also representative samples. And I used actually well-known measures, but for in-group protectionism, I designed a new measurement. Items such as it is important to protect original Dutch norms and values. It is important to preserve the original Dutch culture and traditions. And for ethnic belonging, we would measure this with statements such as a real Dutch person is someone who has Dutch origins. These are also often used items to assess this construct. And national and personal nostalgia I assess in a similar way that I showed you before. And we had again a range of controls here. So here again, I also controlled for personal nostalgia, showing that it's really national nostalgia that relates to national identification and also more immigrant outgroup prejudice. And also I find support for the idea that this effect is at least partially explained by a stronger sense of ethnic belonging, right? So the idea that you can only be a true national when you are of native descent. Yeah, so this is also found in relation to in-group protectionism. So just to sort of wrap up and summarize the first empirical part. So in this part of the research line, I really tried to show that national nostalgia is a distinct collective emotion. So it's distinct from personal nostalgia. And it seems to have positive consequences for the national in-group, right? So it relates to stronger national identification and a tendency to protect national identity, which can help to protect this continuity of the national in-group. But at the same time, it has a destructive side in the sense that it has negative consequences for evaluations of different immigrant and religious outgroups. The explanation that I propose here is based on self-categorization theory and the idea that national nostalgia results in exclusionary nationhood based on the distinction between old-timers and newcomers. So that's the first empirical part. I'm just looking at the time. I think I'll just, if that's okay with you, I'll continue with the second part and then we see whether we can maybe take a short break. Okay for everyone? Yeah, okay, good. So then in a sort of a second step that I tried to take is I wondered whether these findings that I just showed you, whether this is something particular for the Dutch context, right? So I just wanted to see, can we see something like this in other countries? And also I wanted to delve more into this triggers question, right? So where does it come from, this national nostalgia? Is it the idea of in-group discontinuity? That forms the reason why people become nostalgic for the country of their past. So here I present results from a cross-cultural or cross-national study where I basically looked at the following theoretical model. So indeed, is national nostalgia predicted by a sense of in-group discontinuity? But also, does it subsequently result in a stronger feeling, a restoration of in-group continuity through a stronger sense of connection to the national in-group belonging, and rejection of immigrant outgroups? Of course, again, these were cross-sectional data. So I had a data set with 27 countries. This is just a quick picture to show you that we had different countries in a lot of different continents as well. And the survey was part of a bigger project carried out by Jolanda Jette, that some of you might also know from Queensland University in Australia. So this survey included a lot of different measures that was assessed in different countries. And it also included my national nostalgia measure and the more general one. So yeah, I show you the items that we used here. For in-group discontinuity, we sort of had a proxy. We used items related to collective angst, so anxiety about the future of your national in-group. So things like I'm worried about the future vitality of my country, or I feel anxious about the future wealth of my country. And we had measures for prejudice towards immigrants also in this data set. Well, first of all, but this is not so interesting, but we demonstrated that we had measurement equivalence, meaning that the constructs were reliable in each country and that they were also, to a large extent, comparable. But of course, most interesting is the hypothesis testing, where I first estimated the model for all countries simultaneously. And here you see that, well, in most cases, we find relatively strong relationships between the proposed constructs, except for the relationship between anti-immigrant attitudes and a stronger sense of in-group continuity. I'll come back to that later. But most relevant here is also to show what happens when you test this for other countries separately, right? So to what extent do we observe these relationships in the different countries? So we have 27 countries in total, and in 22 we indeed see that in-group discontinuity is positively related to national nostalgia. In 24 countries there's a positive relationship between national nostalgia and in-group belonging, and in 20 out of the 27 national nostalgia relates to anti-immigrant attitudes. And we also find positive indirect effects for these relationships. If we look then at in-group belonging and in-group continuity in 25, so almost all of the countries, this is significant, but for anti-immigrant attitudes, there's actually only in 3 countries it relates to a stronger sense of in-group continuity. So of course this is cross-sectional data, right? So you can estimate all kinds of indirect effects, but you do not really know anything about the causality. So we can just show that this is all positively related. But I'm currently working on a paper that's a longitudinal study with 3 waves, and I'm preparing a revise and resubmit. And here I do find really quite strong evidence for the idea that national nostalgia is triggered by this feeling of in-group discontinuity. And here we had a really good measure for that. So Dutch identity is no longer what it used to be in the past, and 2 more items. And I really find here that it triggers national nostalgia, and that national nostalgia over time results in collective action tendencies, so behavioral intentions to protect the national in-group and to reject immigrant outgroups. So, summing up this part, I have some evidence for the idea that national nostalgia is triggered by a feeling of identity discontinuity, and that the function is indeed to restore also the continuity of the national in-group through a stronger sense of in-group belonging, especially, so not so much through rejecting threatening outgroups, but more forming a stronger connection to well, fellow old-timers, so to say. Consequences, again, seem to be positive for the national in-group, but negative for immigrant outgroups. And this is something that you see cross-culturally. So, of course, yeah, I showed you cross-sectional support across countries, but longitudinal support for these ideas in the Dutch context. So, of course, more work is to be done on the generalizability and also the causality for these mechanisms. What shall we do? I can sort of do the third part, or we can take a short break. What do you think? Finish? Go on?
You can go on for me.
Yeah, because it's not so long anymore.
You decide if you want to take a break.
No, I'm fine. No, for me it's fine. Like I can talk, but I hope you're still with me here.
I think so.
Yes,
okay.
we are.
Yeah. Okay.
So go on. Go on.
Okay. Let's go on then. Okay. So the third part is my most recent line of work, and this is really related to national nostalgia and support for populist radical right parties. And of course, when I started this research, there was already a lot of commentators, opinion makers saying that these parties are so nostalgic and that it's nostalgia voters, right, for Trump and all these parties. But actually, there was no empirical research on this, also not in political science. So that was interesting. So I was like, okay, let's do this empirically then. And I started out in the Dutch context, where we now have two prominent populist radical right parties. Party for Freedom, Partij voor de Vrijheid, and Forum for Democracy, led by Thierry Baudet, and Partij voor de Vrijheid is led by Geert Wilders. Both of them are quite successful in the Dutch context. So this is an article that was published last year in the Journal of Theoretical Social Psychology, which is a relatively new journal in the field, I would say. But it was actually nice because it allowed us to also theoretically expand on this idea. So if you're interested in this article, you also really find extensive description of the link between social psychological literature on national nostalgia and also the political scientific literature on populist radical right parties and their ideology. So I really try to sort of integrate these perspectives here. But there's also, of course, an empirical part. Just to sort of summarize quickly what the connection is, according to us, between national nostalgia and this the ideology of these parties. So most scholars, particularly in political science, agree that the core of the ideology of these parties is nativism. And this nativism is then a key element of their so-called exclusionary populism. Nativism is a term that can be defined as follows. So it's seen as an ideology which holds that states should be inhabited exclusively by members of the native group, which form the nation, and that non-native elements, persons and ideas are fundamentally threatening to the homogeneous nation state. This is a definition from Cas Mudde, one of the most prominent political scientists in the field, and actually most scholars also use this definition. But you can actually summarize it as, so nativism as a combination of ethnic nationalism and also xenophobia. And in the case of Western political radical right parties, populist radical right parties, Islamophobia is the main form of xenophobia in their nativism. Well, what we argue is that in the rhetoric of populist radical right parties, national nostalgia is really used as a way to increase the persuasiveness of their nativist ideology. So as I showed you before, national nostalgia can of course often be used and also triggers processes of social categorization based on the past. And this is typically what these politicians do. So they use nostalgia to divide the society into old-timers, the native majority members, which are part of these glorious days of the national past, versus the newcomers, the immigrants, those who came later and who are portrayed as ruining this past, right, as undermining the continuity of national identity. So in this way, the past is really framed as better because it was just us, right? Because we were culturally and ethnically more homogeneous. So by using national nostalgia, they can sort of use an affective argument, right? So an appeal to emotions is made in order to legitimize their nativist ideology. So this is also what we try to test. So the idea that national nostalgia relates to more support for nativism in the form of ethnic nationhood and Islamophobia, and that this is the reason why national nostalgia is related to more support for these parties in terms of the tendency to vote for these parties, but also feeling sympathy for these parties in general. So this is what I tested with representative sample. Again, I had a measure of national nostalgia that is similar to the one I showed you before. For ethnic nationhood, also a similar measure. For Islamophobia, a feeling thermometer. And to measure support for these parties, people got the question, if parliamentary elections were held today, for which party would you vote? And all parties in parliament were listed. So basically, people could get a binary score, a 1 if they voted for one of these parties, and a 0 if they had another vote. And for sympathy, people got the question, how sympathetic do you find the political parties? And then again, all parties in parliaments were listed. So we selected the 2 populist radical right parties here. And again, we had various control variables in this study. So we had 2 separate models for the 2 dependent variables, but it's not so relevant. We find support indeed for the positive relationship between national nostalgia and the intention to vote for these parties. And even though we find support also for the indirect effects, right, the explanatory mechanism of nativism, it mainly goes through Islamophobia. So, and not so much this notion of ethnic nationhood. So it's mainly the Islamophobia that explains the positive relationship between national nostalgia and the intention to vote for these parties. And this is the same for sympathy, when you use sympathy as a dependent variable. Again, it's cross-sectional data, so well, the causality argument we cannot really assess here. Yeah, and that's actually also part of my discussion, right? So there seems to be some evidence for the idea that national nostalgia in a general sense, right? So when people long for their country of the past, this relates to more support for populist radical right parties. It can be explained by nativist ideology. It also relates to the idea that national nostalgia fosters processes of social categorization based on the past. But of course, you can indeed wonder about the causal mechanisms. It could also be there could also be a reversed mechanism that people who feel sympathy for these parties or vote for these parties become more nostalgic once they start voting for them. And you can also wonder whether this might replicate outside of the Netherlands, but I think there's a big chance that it actually does. So concluding thoughts. National nostalgia thrives across the world, and it's increasingly and successfully harnessed by radical right parties. It's distinct from personal nostalgia, and it tends to have exclusionary consequences for group dynamics in most countries. And it affects populist radical right party support. Well, new directions, and this is my final point. So I'm working also on research that looks at the contents of national nostalgia. So, of course, in this line of research that I presented, I measured nostalgia for the national past in a general way, right? So to what extent are you nostalgic when you think about the country of the past? But you can also, of course, look at specific contents. So what are people actually nostalgic for? When they think about the country of the past. And what I saw in the open-ended answers of some of my participants, also in this nostalgia manipulation, is that some people would write about the time when the country was actually more tolerant and more open towards cultural diversity. So there's some research that's also published together with Michael Wohl from Carleton University in Canada, in which we show that sort of this openness-based national nostalgia can have positive consequences for intergroup relations. So it's not necessarily exclusionary. And I'm also working on a neuroscientific study where we try to see whether there's a relationship between national nostalgia and implicit racial bias. And there's much more I'm working on, but this is in relation to national nostalgia. This is the new part. So, yeah, I hope I roughly I think stayed within the 40 minutes. So thanks a lot for listening. And yeah, I just put a link here with my publications if you are interested in some of these studies. And yeah, you probably have questions for me.
Thank you, Anouk. Yes,
Thank
we
you.
have time for questions. Question?
Maybe you can remove the.
Oh yeah, I will. Yeah, stop sharing. Yeah.